Well, the time is 4 o'clock and about time to get started. Hello, and welcome to Advances and Emergent Needs in Paleo-Geoscience Cyber Infrastructure, a webinar series organized by C4P. C4P is the acronym for Collaboration in Cyber Infrastructure for Paleo-Geosciences, which is an EarthCube research coordination network supported by the National Science Foundation. I'm Mark Ewan and will be your moderator for today. Leslie will be running the WebEx. In today's talk, we'll have 2 presentations, each about 20 minutes, with about 10 minutes after each for questions. And we want to keep to time, so I'll be fairly strict about enforcing time limits. And speakers, I'll give you each a 3-minute warning. If you have questions, please send them through the WebEx chat window, and Leslie will read them aloud after the presentation. And you may send in a question at any time, so she'll hold them till the end of the presentation for the last 10 minutes. All of the presentations you see here and the follow-up discussions will be publicly archived on the EarthCube website and at the C4P YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/Cyber4Paleo. And all this is listed on our website as well. Our first speaker for today is Tom Narock from Marymount University, and he'll be speaking about the OCEANLINK project, which is an EarthCube building block. Our second speaker is Shanan from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He'll be telling us about GeoDeepDive. But first, we'll begin with Tom. And Tom, welcome to the C4P webinar series, and you can begin when you're ready.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am Tom Narock. I'm an assistant professor at Marymount University, and I'm currently leading the OCEANLINK project, which I wanted to tell you about today. So this is an effort to bring semantic web technologies and linked open data to the geosciences. So there exists a wide spectrum of maturing methods, tools, which are collectively known as semantic web or semantic web technologies. And it's been shown that these can vastly help to disseminate and discover scientific research. What researchers in this area have also found is that creating semantic integration also requires input from both domain and cyber infrastructure scientists. And so what we're doing with OCEANLINK, which is an EarthCube building block project, is to demonstrate semantic technologies in one domain within the geosciences. And so we're concentrating on the ocean sciences, and we are attempting to integrate ocean science data repositories with library holdings, conference abstracts, and funded research awards. So we have a wide collection of holdings and related materials, which we think will really show off the power and the utility of semantic web technologies. And we're also exploring the social side of things and the socio-technical aspects of semantic web as well by looking at ontology development and exposure of these technologies to the geoscience communities. So to do this, we've developed a wide and diverse team that covers both the ocean sciences and the computer and cyber infrastructure communities. In terms of ocean science expertise, we're working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and experts at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and myself at Marymount University, along with computer scientists at UMBC and Wright State University, are supplying the cyber infrastructure and semantic web expertise. Now we're tackling a particular problem in the ocean sciences, but we think that this is much more general and much more ubiquitous challenge which researchers in a number of fields face when trying to discover and integrate interdisciplinary resources. I took a look at some of the EarthCube end user workshops and some of the reports that came out of those, and we found common themes across a number of the different geoscience communities. For example, in the Paleo Geoscience workshop, there was notices that there was unawareness and underutilization of standards for data and metadata, that there's difficulties and challenges in importing and exporting data from databases. And one common theme, this particular one came out of the Ocean Omics workshop, but we saw this across the board, is that there's really a need to do federated and complex searches of the available resources. There was requests for Google-like search interfaces and suggestion functions and search engines that could point you to related materials. And it was often a challenge in many domains to even know what was out there to search. Is there any sort of clearinghouse or portal that could distribute my queries across the board, and I wouldn't have to worry about knowing what resources are available to me. And these are some of the challenges that we're addressing, and some of the challenges that I think semantic web technologies are particularly apt to address. So semantic web technologies, they come across the spectrum, and I think Doug Phils did an excellent job of introducing this in the last C4 webinar. We can have everything from so-called weak semantics, meaning there's a hierarchy or a taxonomy, but not too much additional semantic information, not too much reasoning that a machine could do. But the upside is that this takes very little time, very little money, and there's a fairly shallow learning curve to this. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a set of tools and technologies for formal semantics, things like formal ontologies, OWL, RDF. And I completely agree with Doug's assessment from the last presentation, is that there's pros and cons to each of these approaches, and so you really need to be aware of those when you're implementing those. In the OCEANLINK project, we're particularly interested in the more formal, stronger semantics, so we're working with technologies like OWL, RDF, reasoners. Now, of course, there's a much steeper learning curve to this, and so implementation of this must be balanced with what the community is able to implement and how they're able to use it. So in addition to exposing our data using semantic technologies, a big part of OCEANLINK is building cyber infrastructure that will help lessen the burden on their end users. So as I'll show in upcoming slides, we're working on portals which will take full advantage of the semantics and the ability to federate queries, but ideally they'll hide these strong semantics, and they'll hide the need to learn the technologies in any real detail. So hopefully we can take advantage of these technologies, but not force the geoscience community to become experts in all of them. Now, the particular technology that we're using is something called linked open data. This is a data publication methodology that adheres to 4 rules, each of which builds upon the previous one. So the first rule is that everything has a unique identifier. And interestingly enough, this is a need throughout much of the geoscience. I know the paleo community has done a lot of work in this, ocean sciences as well. And one nice thing about using this technology is that this use of unique identifiers comes along with the technology. It's a requirement of using linked open data. So everything has a unique identifier. Everything is web-based and web accessible, so these unique identifiers will be resolvable through HTTP, meaning you should be able to put the identifier into a web browser or some semantic tool and be able to get back some information about that resource. Now, ideally, this information is in a semantic representation. We're using a form called RDF, the Resource Description Framework, which is a semantic web standard. And what this format provides is that the information you get back is both consumable by humans and machines. So machines can take advantage of the semantics and do some inferencing and reasoning with it as well. And then ideally, as the name suggests, you provide links from your data to other linked open data sets so that users can find other related information. So what is it that we're trying to link? Well, ideally, we want to link data sets to other related data sets, but we also want to relate them to additional information that will provide context and make the data more relevant and easier to use. So we're connecting to things like publications, presentations, funded awards, and in the ocean science domain, we're particularly interested in gazetteers and features of interest out in the oceans. Now, for the first round of our project, we've identified 5 data sets that we want to interlink. We're working with the Rolling Deck to Repository, which is at Columbia University and is a central repository for all ocean research vessels. At Woods Hole, they have the Biological and Chemical Ocean Data Archive. We're also working with the Woods Hole Library because we want to link to cruise reports and additional cruise materials that are available there, in addition to PhD theses, master theses, and other research papers that are published at the Woods Hole Library. We're working with National Science Foundation funded awards. Now, this is not just the ocean science funded awards. We have access to all of the NSF funded awards. These are actually publicly available on the web, and so we're working to convert from 1976 through the present into linked open data and connect those to the ocean science resources. We've also worked with the American Geophysical Union to take their entire conference proceedings from 1995 through the present and to convert those to linked open data as well. And we're working to interconnect all of these data sets and make them discoverable and usable. So in the semantic web world, the basic building block is the ontology. And so in creating linked open data, you need to describe your data according to some ontology. There's currently a debate within the semantic web community about how best to do this. There are some that advocate for what's called an upper ontology, or essentially a domain ontology, which is a fairly large, all-encompassing ontology that describes an entire domain, all of its concepts, all of their interrelationships. We don't think, and I think many others don't think that that's potentially scalable in all cases. It's potentially not even feasible in some domains, particularly in the geosciences where it's actively researched domains, and coming to consensus on an entire domain ontology may not even be feasible. So what we are advocating is another approach which goes by the name ontology design patterns. And the idea here is to create many, many small modular ontologies. And so rather than describing an entire domain, you just describe one entire concept and some relationships that are part of that particular concept. So for example, you can see here our design pattern for the cruise and the relationships that exist amongst the cruise and a trajectory. So what we've come up with the OCEANLINK project is a series of these very small modular ontologies. We have them for things like person, organization, award, cruise, repository, and publication. And the idea is that you don't need to implement all of the patterns. You don't need to express your data conforming to all of the ontologies. You just pick the set that most represents your data and most represents how you want to integrate your data into our existing linked open data collections. So some of these design patterns are going to be specific to the ocean community, for example, the cruise. But we think that we have many that are reusable across all of the geosciences, things like awards and publications, repositories, and people. So we think a lot of this semantic modeling that we've come up with is potentially reusable across many of the geoscience domains. So once you have the ontology and the desire to express your metadata and your data holdings as linked open data, how do you actually go about doing that? Well, there's a number of different ways. You could just republish everything as linked open data. So there are RDF databases, and you could express everything in RDF format and just republish everything according to the ontology specifications. But there are also sort of middle-of-the-road approaches, because we know that this is potentially not feasible for everyone. And so relational databases are very popular in the geosciences. Many repositories already have them and would like to continue to use them. So there exist a number of tools and techniques for mapping relational databases to linked open data. So it appears to the outside world as you have linked open data, but really behind the scenes, it's a layer of software that sits on top of a relational database. And so our current implementation has a mixture of these two approaches, and we fully expect that moving forward, we're going to continue to see a mixture of these two approaches. So moving towards linked open data does not imply that you have to do away with your existing infrastructure. Now, converting your data to linked open data, linking it to other data sets is very useful, but it's still a lot of data repositories, and users still have to know, where do I go, how do I query all these different data sets, and how do I potentially federate a query across multiple data sets. So what we're doing with the OCEANLINK project is to also build cyber infrastructure that hopefully lessens this burden. We're building what we call a hub, which is a piece of infrastructure which will provide a facet-based search interface. So you can think of this sort of like a Google for ocean science linked open data. It's one place that you go to. You'll fill out a query using drop-down menus, checkboxes, things of that nature. So very user-friendly. You don't have to become familiar with the semantics behind it. But also what this hub is going to do, it's going to periodically poll the linked open data sources, and it's going to attempt to automatically identify the links between data sets. So for example, a number of ocean science cruises are mentioned in the AGU abstracts. They're also mentioned in the NSF funded award abstracts. So we're going to pull out those links automatically and make those available for search. We're going to do what the computer science community refers to as co-entity resolution. So for example, a research vessel may appear at different ocean science repositories by slightly different names or slightly different identifiers. So we are going to attempt to automatically identify that those are indeed the same research vessel, or that people across these repositories are in fact the same person. So we're going to automatically identify the links across the linked open data sets, make those available for search, and we're going to provide one common interface for a user to submit their query to, and then this hub will federate the search out, aggregate the results, and provide the results back to the user. So we're working on this initial version of the faceted-based search portal. So we're going to allow users to come in and search in a number of different facets, things like cruise, people, organization. You can search by a particular funded project, or you can search by an ocean science program. And then the linked open data and the semantics will be utilized to point you to related data sources, to highlight links between this data set and another data set, to point you to publications and presentations, and to identify generally all supporting materials that would go along with whatever it is that you're attempting to search for. So the search portal is still a work in progress. We're hoping to be up by this summer, but I can't take you through an actual demo of the site, but I can take you through a working example and hopefully demonstrate what this might look like. So let's say that there's a particular research cruise vessel that we're interested in. We know that it's operated out of Lamont Doherty, and there's a particular cruise, EW0408, that we're interested in, that this vessel went on, and we're interested in what results from this particular cruise. So using this OCEANLINK portal, we can federate our query out to a number of different linked open data sets. We can identify that the R2R repository at Columbia has the cruise logs as well as the cruise data, and so we can supply you with links to go and actually download the data if that's what you're interested in. We can tell you that the biological and chemical repository at Woods Hole does not have any data for this particular cruise, but it is aware of the vessel, and that vessel has gone on other cruises, and there's biological and chemical data related from those other cruises which you might be interested in. And so it's this semantics and this use of linked open data that allows the system to know that the vessel at these two different repositories is actually the same thing. But we can also go one step further, and we can tell the user that in the fall of 2005, at the AGU meeting, there was an abstract 446 in this particular session, and that abstract text mentions this particular cruise, and it mentions a data set that came from this particular cruise. So perhaps you may also be interested in checking that out. And so we can do similar things with funded projects and things as well. So the idea here is that we want to exploit the power of the semantics and the linked open data so that users can follow links and explore additional relationships, so that you can find what are other related data that is available. What other publications did a particular author create? Or are there funded projects that mention my data set? Now, using ontologies, we also get the power to do inferencing and reasoning. Ontologies are formal semantic models. So asserting that something is of a particular type, it implies certain properties and relationships, and a computer can take advantage of that and exploit that. So you don't have to explicitly state something. For example, if an instrument is said to be on a particular cruise, we can infer that a certain type of data was collected because of the properties of that instrument, even though it may not be explicitly stated. And so you can exploit this power to really do quality assurance and checking of the data set. So I have a simple example here. We have two repositories which talk about the same cruise, but they have different start and stop dates for it, while the ontology indicates that a cruise can only have one start date and one stop date. And so using semantic web tools, we can infer that this is inconsistent. We can alert the data providers to this. And so we can do a bit of automated quality assurance. Now we're going to do a bit of automated inferencing and automatic identifying of links between data sets, but we know that the data is messy, and there's a chance that we're not going to get all of these correct. Some of the links may not be accurate. So we want to elicit the geoscience community to help us with feedback to better the system. So what we're aiming to do is, on our results page, show these additional relationships to the user and ask them if they do identify anything that is obviously wrong, could they report that back to us? And we're exploring mechanisms to do that using social media, ORCID ID, researcher ID, so that a user could log in, document this information, and then this could be folded back into the system to increase the accuracy of the system. And we can then acknowledge this user and credit them for their additions. So hopefully, I think you can see some relevance to C4P. In particular, we have a large overlap in data, primarily in the cruises. Many of the cruises collect physical samples, which I think are relevant to this community. But also, I think the semantic web approaches and the linked open data are a nice way to connect data with samples, and also to take advantage of the unique identifiers which are common amongst our communities. And so we're learning a lot about deploying these within a community, in particular geoscience community. And so we're gaining some practical experience in that as well, which I think would be relevant to the C4P community. And so just to conclude with a timeline of where we are. So what we have completed so far is the creation of the ontology design patterns. We've had a number of meetings with our community to debate these design patterns, to model the semantics of the community. We've come up with a number of ontology design patterns which are now publicly available. We're currently converting the aforementioned data sets to linked open data, making those publicly available. We're looking to branch out to other geoscience communities, the paleo community, and ecology in particular. And our expectation is that the first version of the OCEANLINK hub, the search interface, should be available by the EarthCube meeting this summer. So that's a mid-June timeframe. And several of us will be attending the C4P meeting this summer as well. So we are very excited to continue discussing with this community the use and applicability of semantic web technologies. So I'll just leave you with those two links. The first one is the main project website, and the second one is the links to the ontologies that we've created so far. So thank you very much for your time, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Tom. If anyone has questions, please type them into your chat window, and Leslie will read them aloud, and we'll be found to answer them. We have about 8 minutes. We can answer questions in.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I have a first group of questions. I think they should be asked in a group. I'm not sure, so you can answer them one at a time if you want. But there's a question from Simon Cox. He asks, what is most useful for co-entity resolution? Do you have indexes of instruments, vessels, cruises, or investigators? And do you use existing lists as a starting point?
For co-entity resolution, for people, we are starting with the National Science Foundation funded awards, which is a really good repository for full names, organizations. We're also attempting to utilize ORCID IDs, although they're not ubiquitous across the geoscience communities. But wherever possible, we'd like to utilize a unique identifier like that. But we do have some controlled lists for people. R2R is in many regards a definitive source for cruises, so we're using that for entity resolution in that regard. So yes, we do have some lists that we're working from, and we're working with various techniques. This is actually a very open and ongoing research topic within computer science right now. So we're exploring a number of different state-of-the-art algorithms to see which ones are better than others and under which circumstances.
Okay, thanks. I think this is a related follow-up question, what you just mentioned, but this question is, if you had to deal with the issues of aligning cruise IDs or other vocabularies from different systems, how have you done this? So maybe a little bit more information on the different methods you're investigating.
Of how are we aligning cruise IDs?
Just have you had to deal with the issue of aligning vocabularies like that from different systems? What methods have you used to do that?
In terms of aligning the different vocabularies, that was done with in-person, face-to-face meetings with computer scientists and geoscientists. We had a number of workshops at the end of last year where we got the community together, or at least within our ocean science community, and attempted to identify what are the existing vocabularies that are out there now, how are they being used, what kind of semantics do we need for this particular project, and then through a series of workshops, we kind of first sketched that out on paper, what that would look like, and then came up with our ontology design patterns, which are the formal OWL ontologies, which we think covers that integration.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, you mentioned in the introduction that you're looking at the social aspects of creating and using ontologies. Can you comment more on that or any lessons learned?
Well, yes, I think these in-person workshops were really successful. I think the community, the geoscience community, is open to these ideas. They want to see this interlinking, and I think the semantic applications that are out there now have been fairly successful. So I think there's a willingness from the community. So I think these in-person, face-to-face meetings where we explain the technology, give some demonstrations, actually do some modeling exercises is a very good approach to first exposure to semantics. The other side of that is the crowdsourcing aspect that we were looking at, which is opening this up to end users to comment on the results and to identify were the links that we identified accurate and relevant. And we've done a couple initial studies in that area, and it turns out that as long as there's not too much overhead and it's not too intrusive on end users, that they are willing to give us feedback and to help us validate what we automatically infer from the semantics.
Okay, thanks. So now here's a comment to see if you have any comment back, but it's noted that there's differences between upper ontologies and domain ontologies, where the upper ontology attempts a universal structure for knowledge. The domain ontology may be aligned with the upper ontology. but that inherits assumptions built into it. So do you have any comment about the use of the two in this project?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that comment. I may have misspoken earlier in the presentation, but I would agree with that distinction. I would just add that the ontology design pattern methodology that we're working with in this is distinct from both of those, and it's an attempt to create more smaller modular ontologies. But I would agree with that comment in general.
Okay, here's one more question. How valuable do you think the inference capabilities will be to the overall application versus simply the linking and integrating of data? There's some controversy regarding the value of more sophisticated inferencing. What inference engine are you using?
We're using Jenna, which is an open source Java-based framework for semantic web, and then we're using Pellet Reasoner, and then in Virtuoso in terms of RDF databases. But yeah, I think there is a lot of value in inferencing, and I think that's going to be where all of this heads in the future. I think there's certainly also a lot of value in just linking data sets to each other, and that there's a lot that you can discover in that regard. But I think that there's additional information that only inferencing can provide, which is going to be essential for long-term semantic discovery and semantic search.
Okay, Mark, do we have time for one last question?
One quick one.
Okay. Okay, last question is, what resources will you offer data providers to help them publish their existing data as linked data?
We are offering our team members to initially over the phone or via WebEx to go through the tools and technologies, how to do this. We've also gone out and done some on-site, in-person work. But ideally, yeah, we're just trying to educate them on the tools, the methodologies, to provide them working examples from other repositories. So we have a number of existing data sets that we can point them to show them working examples. And then we've also, on several occasions, gone out to work with them in person.
Great. Tom, thanks so much for your presentation and answering everyone's questions. I do think it's time to move on to our next presenter, which is Shanan Peters. And he's going to talk to us about GeoDeepDive, and I'll let him explain what it is and how it works. Shanan, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to give an overview of an EarthCube building block proposal called EarthCube-DeepDive that we're putting together to collaborate for a project between myself, Chris Ray, who's now at Stanford, and Maroon Libby at UW-Madison. So in preparing this presentation, I don't really need to say to this group too much about the importance of our data, but it is worth pointing out that EarthCube's been very good at recognizing that we have these two different worlds when it comes to the domains of geoscience they're trying to integrate in EarthCube. We have instrument gathered data on the one hand, which has very, by definition, well-defined data structures, national data facilities to deal with those structures, very strict and supportive access protocols on the one hand. And then, of course, we have the one that we care about here in paleogeosciences, sample-based data. That is data that are intimately tied to humans at every step of acquisition in the field, whether they're handheld to an instrument and so forth. And these two different worlds are really, really, really challenging for EarthCube to address in full. And I have to give them credit for putting a really good effort, as this RCM shows, towards taking advantage of sample-based data. And of course, these data end up in places like this, as you well know, museum buildings, which hold many, many millions, untold millions, really, of specimens that provide valuable scientific information. Some of this hard-earned sample data ends up here, if it's lucky, in libraries in the forms of published documentation of sample-based information in the form of figures and tables and text that provide really a great deal of what we know about Earth's history in particular, but all kinds of different aspects of the modern world in its present state as well. And of course, I don't need to say to this paleogeosciences-oriented community that these types of data are really important. Sample-based data and their synthesis into databases effectively are key to addressing a wide range of very important questions that we really just don't have a way to get our heads around completely in the absence of. So we really need to take advantage of these sample-based data, and this needs to be happening in a variety of different ways by many, many different teams. Okay, so of course, we've recognized for a long time that synthesis sample-based data, aggregating them and repurposing them to address larger scale questions that can't possibly be investigated by one person collecting one set of samples in the field, we've recognized for a long time that this is very important, and there are a number of databases that have been produced as a result of these science drivers. Notably, the paleobiology database, who our host, Mark Ewan, talked about at a recent C4P webinar. You can watch it there. I don't need to say too much more about it, but the paleobiology database is one such resource. Macrostrat is another one. I don't have time to really tell you much about it, but if you want to see a presentation that outlines some of the things that it does, you can check out that YouTube video later from EarthScope's national meeting just recently. G-plates, I'm also not going to have time to talk about at this particular webinar, but it's also ultimately a sample-based data set that goes into constraining paleogeography, geophysics space as well. And it's also a sample-based tool. These three things have come together and form a very, very crude space-time scaffolding. And really, it's resources like these, not just these, of course, but resources like these that really do provide the edifice that is our understanding of many, many important dimensions of Earth. But all of them, these resources and all the others included, really are just a scaffolding. We can get a rough idea of the dimensions of the building. We can get a rough idea of what it might look like when it's completed. But by far, most of the information is not included in them. And there are a lot of work to erect. So the paleobiology database, a very, very big collaborative group, have combined for a keystroking time of 9 continuous years. That's what about would take you if you sat down right now and didn't stop entering data from papers into this database. It would take about 9 continuous person years. And even after all of this work, we have just a few % of all the paleontological knowledge that we know is out there in the world. And the current pace of entry is barely enough to keep up with the new literature that's being produced, fortunately, on the fossil record all the time. Macrostrat, similarly, more time than I care to admit, a fair bit of data, but it's just very small, trivial fraction of all the data that we have available on the geological record. So the question is, how do we move past this very crude scaffolding for our understanding of Earth history and towards at least something that picks up all the bricks that are on the ground and attempts and puts them into a reasonable order quickly in a time frame that's reasonable? And that's where DeepDive comes in. And so I'm going to spend most of the time here telling you a bit about what DeepDive is, what it does, and how we got to the point where we are, which I'll hopefully make relatively clear for you. DeepDive, I want to say this whole project is, I just have to tip my hat here to NSF over EarthCube. And one of the things it has done is prompted a bunch of discussion among bunches of people who normally would have very little opportunity to interact. And that's even true for me on my own campus. EarthCube directly facilitated the on-campus collaboration between Marone Livney at our Center for High Throughput Computing, who runs Condor and the US Open Science Grid, Chris Ray across the street, literally from me in the Department of Geoscience, who works on machine reading and learning approaches. Had EarthCube not come along, I probably never would have met these individuals on my own campus. And this particular collaboration started out as a very local focused team, and I think we've been able to make some good progress that way, because ultimately EarthCube is a big challenge, but a lot of the work, as you guys know, has to get done locally. So thanks to NSF and the EarthCube idea and concept to launching this. It's been a lot of fun for me. Okay, so how did this start? Well, it started at on the campus level, and Marone Livni showed me the capabilities of DeepDive currently, and he said, well, can you use this? I said, of course I can. How about TOC data? I want TOC data for Macrostrat. It'd be nice to know how much organic carbon is in these rocks that I have a pretty good feeling for in space and time. I'd love to be able to measure organic carbon flux, for example, more precisely. So I just made something up. Chris Ray literally said, well, it'll take about 2 days. That's no problem. Our graduate student, Su Zhang, also at Wisconsin, said, sure, I can help you do this. Marone Livni provided the considerable horsepower needed to do this computationally by leveraging the US Open Science Grid and millions of CPU hours at our disposal. So it was the perfect team, and out the other end, literally in a few days, it was too easy a problem, came this frequency distribution. This is a very high-level summary of thousands, tens of thousands of TOC measurements that were extracted from the text tables and figures of documents linked to geological data. And this is, to my knowledge, the first frequency distribution of TOC at a continent scale ever. And when you parse that out a little bit, you see very interesting patterns. For example, when you look at just the black shale component, which of course is an important source of TOC measurements generally, there's multi-modes, and those modes turn out to be geologically interesting for all kinds of reasons. So that's how this got started, and these types of data are important because we can do things like integrate them with Macrostrat and calibrate organic carbon variable flux as a function of time using Macrostrat's continuous time age model. And this is the starting point for some interesting science, all of which was made possible by integrating sample-based data that are readily accessible out in the world's literature. So this project ultimately led to GeoDeepDive, which basically is the test version that was a proof of concept demonstration that, yes, we can leverage DeepDive technology to great success in geoscience potentially. And so building on this sort of initial pilot start, EarthCube funded the effort to keep going and see what we can do with turning this into ultimately a EarthCube building block that can be leveraged by a much bigger community. And so now what our charge is to develop a more complete cognitive computing infrastructure. What that really means is machine reading and learning infrastructure, and which is considerable to support geoscience. Okay, so this is what I want to spend most of the time focusing on. What is DeepDive anyway? I think the easiest way to approach this is to tell you what DeepDive is not. DeepDive is not Google. So here's Google, and of course we all know Google. This is what it looks like, and you might be interested in total organic carbon, so you type it in and you hit go, and this is what you get. You get 7,220,000 results, 0.25 seconds, very impressive. But this is, and now Google on the right, you can see, is starting to get savvy to the fact that you might actually want to know something about total organic carbon. They're trying to do a little bit of a stack summary on the right there, using some approaches that overlap in some ways with DeepDive. But the result you get back from Google is not particularly helpful. Perhaps you say, well, that's because you use Google. What about Google Scholar? Well, the same thing, right? You have to know what you're looking for when you go there, and when you find what you're looking for, there's a lot of it, 2.1 million results, which by my calculation would take a long time to read and access those documents and do anything with it. Okay, so DeepDive is not Google. DeepDive is also not a standard sort of text processing approach. So this is on the cover of Science magazine not too long ago, and they had a big thing on big data and science and what it meant and the challenges it offered and the research opportunities it brought. And Science's version of big data was to make a Wordle of something. I'm not even sure I can remember what went into this Wordle, but it's sort of a one text analysis that you've probably come across. DeepDive is also not a text analysis where it takes snippets of text and analyzes them in some way. For DeepDive, you need to think more like, it's more along the lines of IBM's Watson, which you may be familiar with. It's a computing system that's highly tuned to perform well at Jeopardy. It was initially funded by DARPA's machine reading Grand Challenge, and it beat humans in Jeopardy famously not long ago. And now it's being used at Cancer Sloan Research Center to diagnose some form of cancer with high efficiency because it's a system that's what you need to think about when you think about DeepDive. So what is DeepDive? DeepDive is a machine reading infrastructure that extracts information from text tables and figures, and here's the key that I'll try to expose a little bit for you, in a way that achieves a much deeper level of understanding than many previous generation systems. Okay, so let me give you an example of what that means. So here, for example, is what you would see if you opened this issue of Journal of Paleontology. We have a bunch of structured text that, to us as humans reading it, has immediately has information content to it. We have images and captions and so forth. DeepDive effectively attempts to do what you do when you read a paper. It doesn't. You don't need to give it XML or processed text. In fact, we don't do that. We start with the visual information contained within the document. That's the sizing of the fonts, the arrangement of the parts. All of that carries with it information, and sometimes, frankly, as humans, we're sloppy in how we express information because we rely sometimes on conveying information just by virtue of section headings and layout and figures and so forth. So DeepDive is a visually oriented system that also combines processing of the text. So what this means is that we use a variety of low-level approaches. What this effectively means is we use a variety of low-level starting points, so processing the documents in a variety of different ways, in order to allow us to make higher-level inferences about the relationships of this figure to the text elements that you see here, for example. So let me just show you a little bit at the low level how this works. So on the upper left there, you can see a little snippet of text, systematic paleontology. The first step in DeepDive's approach is to parse the document using a variety of different OCR, optical character recognition, and NLP, natural language parsing approaches. And usually we use one or more of these approaches simultaneously. So on the right is an example of NLP, and it's a bunch of, you can see on the left there the sort of strings that go into it, and then there's a bunch of gobbledygook that corresponds to the location of that thing in the document, or in terms of physically, and then it's been decomposed into parts of speech and so forth there in a coded fashion. So the first step of DeepDive is to process the documents and basically create, to create a database of things like this. On the lower one there, you can see an example of OCR output, and there we have the same text, but instead of being parsed out by natural language, there's descriptors that tell us something about the structure of the element. So the centered, are they font special, and so forth, and the location within the document as well. And so these are sort of the first level parsing that gets done. The original document and layout information explicitly is carried through in this process. Okay, so we start with a bunch of exactly what you would start with sources of information. They can be papers, that's what I'll focus on here, published documents in the literature, but they could be structured databases, they could be websites, they could be Excel files, they could be anything as a potential starting point. You do that with optical recognition and natural language processing steps. And then you bring to the table a variety of different things. And you can think about this as basically the question you're interested in. And what that means is that if you have a well-formulated question, like for example the paleobiologists did when they set out to create the paleobiology database manually, they had a very good question that required an explicit data structure to answer it satisfactorily. And basically that's what we mean by a data structure. A well-formulated question is an important starting point here, because that's going to define a structure that's of importance to you. There might be many different structures, but that's an important first step. You bring to the table rules. And what I mean by rules is basically how you would take one of these documents or whatever the source of data is and sit down and describe to a sixth grader how it is you would recognize something like a genus in the published literature. Now, paleontologists just look and they know, but how do you know when you see a genus, or when you see a geological unit, or when you see any of the L or sort of location, a geographic location? How do you recognize that as such? A set of rules for how you recognize entities in the document. You might bring to the table dictionaries, and this is the part I'm fascinated by. Dictionaries would be things, anything. They could be boring lists. Here's a list of all the formations I know about in the United States. That's extremely useful. Here's a list of all the, and they can have typos, it doesn't matter. Just any sort of information that you can bring to the table in the form of basically lists of things. If you have relations, examples, that would constitute training data. So for example, the paleobiology database has human-constructed data structures extracted from documents. Those data can be used as training data to basically distantly supervise DeepDive as it goes. You can also just give feedback by saying, yes, you did a good job, no, you didn't do a good job. These things together combine to allow you to recognize features a priori, based on crude starting points, not lists of what to look for. These features can be extracted and then contextualized with relationships to one another. So for the Paleo project, I'm going to show you, this is a sort of typical DeepDive pipeline for how this works. You start with a journal article, we extract features, and those would be things like species and geological formations and time intervals and so forth. And those you can write very simply using any number of different scripting languages that you might like. And then those features get extracted by the pipeline into databases effectively that contain the individual entities that you've recognized, and the feature being the relationship among them and how you recognize that relationship. And then the big challenging computational part is to produce the factor graphs of huge and reasonable size data sources like journal articles, huge. And so a lot of the DeepDive advanced computationally has been how to efficiently and computationally realistically address this problem. And ultimately it comes down to a probabilistic approach. And this probabilistic approach has a lot of advantages, not least of which is that regardless of how hard you try to find and define hard and strict rules for how language is used, for example, in paleontological documents, the fact is that there is some sloppiness, and a probabilistic approach allows you to address that. It also allows you to address the problem of taking highly unstructured, widely heterogeneous information and distilling it into a very rigid structure. And so this probabilistic approach is very useful for a variety of different reasons. And you can read the DeepDive, some of the DeepDive contributions to learn more about how that is done efficiently. And then there's a statistical inference and learning step that results in the output of the target data structure, that is relationships between, say, a taxon occurs in a formation, occurs in a time interval at some place, that would be a 4-tuple. There's a relation that's output, and every single entity at every level has some probability associated with it. And the weights of various features that you might use to say how these entities are attributed are acquired by the extent to which they're able to explain the data in the database, say the journal articles. What that means is I might have very good ideas about how the paleontological records put together in the literature in my mind, and I might say this is a rule, but if the data don't bear that rule out, it's not given a lot of weight. And then the end result are some reporting and calibration plots that I don't have time to go into here, but it basically allow you to assess how the system is doing. And then it's an iterative process effectively. Okay, so for Paleo DeepDive project, the hypothesis is that we can generate an empirical history of life by reading the paleontological literature with a precision that's about as good or better than, in some cases, humans. And then the last part's sort of a red herring. If you want to know more about this, you can Google this, and there's a little video, cheesy video that will give you a sense. But I'm going to give you an abstract. There's 3 stages to this process. Project, we're going to process the exact same documents that the humans did, and they're going to be exactly the same. We're going to extract the same facts, and then we're going to expand that to incorporate the world. And then this is the fun part at the end I'm not going to talk about, which is how it relates to the rest of the world that we don't currently think about as paleobiologists, which is awesome, but that's for another time. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip by this. These numbers are pretty boring. They're just how many things, how many taxonomic entities were extracted from the documents. I just want to say one thing. We came into this with no list of here are the species, DeepDive, go find them. DeepDive recognizes how taxonomic entities, species, genera, families, orders, classes, phyla, etc., how those names are expressed in the literature. It recognizes that, and then it builds the list of names for you from the literature dynamically. And it does a very good job. The relevant one down there is starred with little asterisks. 58,902 taxonomic names were never entered by humans in the PaleoDB from any of the references they read. And we sampled these, and 90% of these are, in fact, feels, honest to goodness, at least 90%, probably more, are really good, honest to goodness species names, and the rest are OCR errors typically, which are frustrating, but one of the biggest sources of error that will improve in the future as OCR gets better and better. How good are the data? Well, we did a little experiment where we gave various taxonomic extractions, for example, to humans and asked them to assess them. And the trick of them, on them, I guess it was that it was a mixture of both Paleo DeepDive's extractions and human extractions from the same document. And the results show that two things. One is that humans kind of disagree about what's right and what's wrong. This is expected and routine, apparently. When asked humans how well humans do, apparently the answer is always 80%. I didn't know that. That seems to be about right. DeepDive does, on the right there in all those plots, does as well or better than humans for pretty much all tasks. And there's disagreement that basically comes down to what constitutes taxonomy formally or not between humans. The real results, though, are what we're interested in getting at in the first place, the history of life. This is what the humans generate. This is what the machine generates by reading these documents and aggregating the information required to do a derivative analysis, like the range stratigraphically of genera has to be derived by recognizing genera across documents and determining their ages of occurrence. Basically, we're measuring the same signal in the same documents. This is for a much larger corpus, but I just wanted to put this in here to emphasize that this is DeepDive extracted data partitioned into the classes of organisms that DeepDive classified those occurrences into based on the taxonomy it creates. So this is very familiar to the paleobiologists who might be watching. It does a very good job. This almost, quite as a side note, is very, very, very close to Jack's curve. Now, it's been shown that these aggregate results are very, very, the central limit theorem loves those. You can get most things wrong and still get the overall result right. And so we were interested in knowing at the finest scale, as an individual genus, how well do we do? This is one way to measure that. This is the difference between what Paleo DeepDive estimates the genus duration to be and the genus either first on the bottom or last occurrence geologically, and what the humans estimated the same genera that were common to both. And you can see there that the distributions are very, very, very tightly distributed, about 0, and we seem to be doing a pretty good job at even the low-level individual facts that go into making a diversity curve. So that's what we're trying to do, but the exciting thing about it is, unlike something like the paleobiology database, you just don't end up with a database. It's very useful, but it's static. It's effectively another paper in some regards. You still have to go in and changing it or adding it is very time-consuming, difficult. Paleo DeepDive, however, has the whole body of knowledge underneath of it to support it, and it changes. Anytime there's new information added, new rules added, new feedback given, or new data added to the system, the whole thing can change. And we can recognize and associate information that's not currently part of a structured database. So to get at this, we're just taking the obvious one here, and that's those images up on the upper right. Those are very integral to biological systematics. They're always part of a biological description, although I suppose gene sequences are usually part of, say, for prokaryotes and archaea and bacteria and so forth. But usually figures are an important part of organismal biology, systematics, and they're very underutilized quantitatively. And DeepDive's perfectly able to process that. So what we're trying to do is basically extract individual figures, associate them by virtue of their text to the text descriptions and the captions and the document itself, and then do morphometrics, basically. In the interest of time, I don't need to show you this, but we can, up in the upper left is a little partial pedicle of a brachiopod, and you can see how we process the image and recognize that, wait a second, these are two specimens that have been juxtaposed, and we get that out the other end, and those are the two things we're going to analyze in isolation, even though there's been a little trick here by the imaging. And that's an extreme example. Usually they're much easier to sort of process. And then, of course, the fun part for DeepDive is that joint inference. That's a big part. It's what distinguishes us from Watson or some of these other initiatives, is the computational advances allow us to do difficult joint inference problems that have been shied away from for quite a lot of time. And the joint inference applies between images and text too. And so we are able to parse out these texts and infer a bunch of different things, not only about the image, but also its context taxonomically and so forth. So that's our sort of playground right now for developing what really does amount to very general capabilities. And our goal is to, first of all, of course, help the paleobiology database grow. We're not replacing it. By contrary, by contrast, we're hoping to augment it with new data types to make it go further and do better things. And we're eventually going to turn the paleo deep dive apparatus over to that governing board, and hopefully it'll be productive. We'll see. It's not all rosy. We run up into some major hurdles that involve what we'd like to start with, and that is the existing corpus of knowledge that's out there on the rock record, especially, but other biological records and so forth as well. We have a real challenge on our hands to get past some very arbitrary barriers that currently exist to doing this, and I don't need to bore you with those details now, but it is very frustrating. And fortunately, we are making some good progress, but that is a whole other dimension of our building block that, like many times, you don't anticipate having to deal with, but we are right now. So what are we hoping to do with this? Well, we're using 3 examples just to get started and building general capability that we hope will form one important component of the complex ecosystem of solutions that need to exist as part of EarthCube. And ultimately, we're going to measure our success not by our ability to do cool things, although, of course, that will be part of it, but really how much we're able to turn this over and make it something that can be leveraged creatively by a much bigger audience, and that can really, I think, bring to the table sample-based data in a way that has been difficult up to this point. So with that, I'll leave you with a pretty picture of some fossils and take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Shannon. And I can attest to you all as one of Shannon's human test subjects. It's pretty amazing to see what GeoDeepDive can extract from a paleontological paper. So hopefully you've been sending questions to Leslie. So Leslie, what do you got?
All right, great, thank you. So the first question is, can you explain a little bit more about the original question to get the TOC plots that you showed? What was the question, the data structure, and the rules that you mentioned?
Okay, that's a good question because it illustrates the starting point. And this cartoon was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it was pretty much how it played out. So Macrostrat, of course, I had. Now Macrostrat has a structure. It's spatially explicit. It's temporally explicit. There's language that describes rock units, so the Mancos shale and so forth, and a hierarchy of names, relationships, and so it has information. What it lacks is things like measurements that might come from those rocks. And so this, as a test project, the question I was literally interested in is I want to put into Macrostrat TOC measurements so that I can arrive at something like this that's calibrated with actual TOC measurements rather than doing general shale has this much, black shale has that much kind of an approach, because as you can see, black shales vary widely in their actual TOC content. So that was the starting point scientifically. So we effectively started with Macrostrat. I talked to Suh here and said, okay, so here's how TOC is expressed in the literature, literally with a pencil and a paper. It's called total organic carbon. It's sometimes called weight percent carbon. It's almost always expressed as a proportion or a percent. It comes from sedimentary rocks typically, but it might also come from sediments and so on. So you get sort of a general list of rules, and then you find a few examples in the literature. So here's a table, for example, that has this. Here's a figure that has this, and so on. And then we write a set of feature extractors that relate TOC measurements to so actually the end product of that is this. So this is actually what it looks like. So this is a strat unit name here, which in a rank that it's associated to the TOC measurement. And then in this case, we've just snipped out the provenance, which sometimes is a caption of a table or sometimes is a sentence in a table and so forth. And it's just a big long list of provenance, document, and measurement. Now the underlying document is still there, but you can check out the YouTube video for more information, and that's it. And it literally was almost too fast. I wasn't prepared to deal with the data when I got it, honestly, at some level. Still playing with it. So that's how it starts. we need a structured data set to start, in the sense that we had one in Macrostrat, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. We have a next question that is, does each hypothesis require human test subjects to provide a metric of accuracy?
It doesn't, actually. So if you have something like the paleobiology database, so for example, our accuracy is we can compare directly against what the humans have produced on a very granular basis, so fact by fact in a document, or in an aggregate sort of synthetic result sense like you're seeing here. The more feedback you get, the better. One of the cool things about DeepDive is that it treats everything as evidence. And what that means is that it may or may not be correct, including the feedback you give it. So the more evidence that you have, and that evidence can be in the form of more documents, it can be in the form of more rules, it can be in the form of additional data sets that you say, these are good data sets created by humans, which are always going to have error no matter what, but that's still evidence, that might be very good evidence. And all of that goes into improving the quality of the extractions. And yes, we can do traditional training examples, mechanical Turk type jobs that say, is this right, is this not, and so on. All of that information is important.
Thank you. The next question is, what are some of the biggest challenges for the figure processing to get useful information?
Well, we have high hopes for this one. We're just getting started with this. The image processing thing is literally only started in the past few months. And I should say we have the benefit of comparing John Payne here. I'm currently at Stanford on research leave. John Payne created a human version of this database for body size, by reading the treatise of invertebrate paleontology. And the humans generated the curve in blue for Brachiopoda, and then on a paired basis. That doesn't mean that, what that means is that not only we made the measurement, but we've linked it to a specific genus that is paired to the human estimates, is given by the gray curves there, and those are not different by any statistical tests that you want to do. So we're measuring the same on a paired basis out of the literature and body size. It turns out that many of the image and processing tasks are fairly easy. The biggest hurdles we run into, I would say, are access to documents. That's a whole different world, but that's one problem. And then the other problem is OCR. When we do have failures, there are almost always limitations of current OCR software, and we're constantly trying to find ways to improve that. We have, in fact, joint inference turns out to be a very powerful way to overcome some OCR errors, by the way, as you can imagine. Of course, there is a computational demand, but honestly, those are cheap today. With the open science grid, that's huge horsepower, and then even internal big multi-core systems can crank through these things relatively efficiently. The bigger computational challenge is the inference step, which is, there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of branches in those factor trees you have to navigate.
Okay, there are no further questions at this time.
Cool. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Let me thank both our speakers, Shanan Peters and Tom Narock, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks at our next C4P webinar. And check out the videos of previous ones if you missed any on our YouTube site. Thanks much.